Year 1835, New York. After the Great Fire, large underground levels were discovered, but filled in and reclassified as debris. The winter of 1835 pressed down on New York with unusual severity. Ice sealed the rivers, wind cut through narrow streets, and water drawn for daily use froze before it could be poured. When fire broke out in the commercial district, it moved with a speed that felt disproportionate to its origin, carried by dry timber, crowded warehouses, and the momentum of a city built upward and inward at the same time. Flames crossed blocks faster than men could respond. Buildings collapsed into one another. By morning, large sections of the financial quarter lay in ruins, reduced to smoking outlines and blackened stone. In the days that followed, the city confronted destruction at ground level. Streets were cleared, walls were pulled down, and surfaces that had been sealed for decades were opened again. What remained visible above ground matched expectation. Collapsed facades, fractured beams, charred masonry. The scale of the disaster was measured in lost structures and interrupted commerce. The narrative of the fire settled quickly into one of loss and rebuilding, of resilience and forward motion. New York would rise again, stronger, more orderly, more modern. Yet as debris was removed and foundations exposed, attention shifted briefly downward. Beneath the burned streets, workers encountered spaces that did not resemble collapsed basements or simple cellars. Large underground rooms appeared, their walls intact, their forms deliberate. Stone corridors extended beyond the footprint of individual buildings. Arched ceilings supported loads above with a confidence that suggested design rather than improvisation. These were not cavities created by fire. They were spaces that had existed before it. The ground had been peeled back enough to reveal them clearly. Some chambers opened into others. Some followed straight lines where walls met at right angles. Stonework showed consistency in thickness and alignment. These underground structures did not present themselves as fragments. They appeared whole, continuous, part of something larger than a single property. Their scale exceeded what would normally be required for storage beneath a warehouse. Their construction implied planning that extended beyond the needs of any one building destroyed in the fire. Descriptions from the period note these findings without emphasis. They appear in reports as features encountered during cleanup, obstacles to be managed rather than subjects of inquiry. The language used to describe them remained practical, oriented toward removal and safety. What lay below ground was treated as part of the aftermath, not as a separate layer of the city deserving its own explanation. As reconstruction plans advanced, these underground spaces were filled. Stone chambers were packed with rubble, corridors were sealed, the ground was leveled and built over again. Streets resumed their grids. New buildings rose where old ones had fallen. Within a short time, the surface of the city no longer showed signs of what had been uncovered beneath it. The episode faded into the background of recovery. What remained was an asymmetry between what was seen and what was remembered. The Great Fire of 1835 entered history as a turning point in urban development, a moment that accelerated modernization and reshaped the city's architecture. The underground spaces revealed during its aftermath did not enter that story in the same way. They did not become landmarks or case studies. They were categorized, managed, and then removed from view. Standing in modern New York, it is difficult to imagine those moments of exposure. The streets feel continuous. The buildings suggest uninterrupted progress. Nothing at ground level hints at large, coherent spaces once opened and closed beneath the city. And yet, for a brief period after the fire, the surface of New York was thin enough to reveal something else, something that did not fit neatly into the familiar narrative of growth from ground up. The question that arises is not dramatic. It does not accuse or insist. It emerges quietly from the sequence of events itself. Why do these underground spaces, once visible and documented as part of the aftermath, occupy so little space in the story New York tells about its own past? In the early 19th century, New York stood at a threshold between mercantile town and emerging metropolis. Its lower districts clustered along the waterfront, where wharves, counting houses, and warehouses formed the economic core of the city. Streets were narrow, buildings closely packed, and construction favored materials that were readily available and economical, above all timber. Commerce moved through these spaces at speed, and the density that made trade efficient also made the city vulnerable. The financial district concentrated risk. Warehouses stored dry goods, paper, textiles, and alcohol, Heat sources were common, and fire suppression infrastructure remained limited. Winter compounded these dangers. In December, cold tightened its grip on the city, freezing water lines and rendering pumps ineffective. When fire ignited in this environment, it found little resistance. Flames leapt from roof to roof, fed by wind and proximity. Attempts to create fire breaks through demolition came too late to halt the spread. The Great Fire of 1835 unfolded rapidly and decisively. Within hours, large sections of the commercial quarter were destroyed, buildings collapsed inward as structural supports failed. Stone facades remained standing in places, but interiors burned out completely. By the time the fire was contained, the scale of loss was evident. Hundreds of buildings were gone. The economic damage was severe, but the city's response was immediate and pragmatic. Attention shifted from mourning to rebuilding. Official accounts of the fire emphasized this transition. Reports detail the causes, the course of destruction, and the extent of damage. They record decisions made by city authorities to improve fire safety, widen streets, and modernize infrastructure. Insurance mechanisms were tested and reformed. New construction standards were discussed. The fire became a catalyst for change, a moment that justified a more durable, orderly city. Reconstruction proceeded with urgency. Clearing debris was essential not only for rebuilding but for restoring commerce. Rubble was removed, foundations assessed, and streets re-leveled. Where buildings had collapsed, new ones were planned. The emphasis remained forward-looking. The city's identity, in this telling, is shaped by resilience. Destruction is acknowledged as temporary, a setback overcome through planning and investment. Within this standard narrative, the ground beneath the streets plays a limited role. Foundations are mentioned as technical concerns, obstacles to be managed during cleanup. Basements and cellars are understood as parts of individual buildings, not as elements of a larger subsurface environment. The story moves from fire to renewal without lingering below grade. This framework is coherent and well supported. It aligns with documented priorities of the period and reflects the administrative focus of the sources. The Great Fire is remembered as an event that reshaped New York's skyline and building practices, not as one that revealed unexpected layers of the city's past. The official record appears complete, sufficient to explain both the disaster and the transformation that followed. The first strain on this completeness emerges not from contradiction but from addition. As workers cleared burned structures and engineers assessed damage, they encountered spaces beneath the surface that did not conform neatly to expectations. These encounters are recorded in practical terms, embedded within reports focused on removal and reconstruction rather than interpretation. Accounts from laborers and overseers describe underground areas that extended beyond the footprints of the buildings above them. These were not shallow basements filled with debris. They were rooms and corridors built with intention. Walls of dressed stone stood intact, meeting vaulted ceilings designed to carry significant load. The geometry was consistent, surfaces were finished rather than rough. These features suggested construction that predated the fire and operated independently of the structures that had collapsed above. The scale of these underground spaces mattered. Ordinary storage cellars, common in mercantile buildings, are typically confined to the dimensions of a single lot. They support limited loads and rely on simple construction. The spaces encountered after the fire exceeded these parameters. Some extended laterally beyond property lines. Others connected across areas where multiple buildings had stood. Their depth and continuity distinguished them from foundations meant solely to support timber structures. The difference between debris and structure became apparent during clearance. Debris is irregular. It consists of broken materials displaced by force. It accumulates unevenly and offers little resistance once removed. The underground features described in the aftermath of the fire resisted this categorization. They were coherent. They required deliberate effort to dismantle or fill. Their persistence slowed reconstruction rather than facilitating it. Despite this, the language used to describe them remained administrative. They were obstacles, not subjects. Engineers noted their presence to account for delays or costs. Workers reported their removal as part of routine clearance. There was no parallel effort to map or document them as an integrated system. Their existence entered the record only insofar as it affected rebuilding. This treatment reflects priorities rather than denial. The city needed to be restored quickly. Anything below ground that did not serve immediate plans was considered expendable. Filling and leveling offered the fastest path forward. In this context, categorizing underground spaces as rubble or fill simplified decision-making. It reduced complexity at a moment when efficiency was paramount. Yet the distinction lingers. Debris implies destruction. Structure implies design. The underground features uncovered after the fire exhibited characteristics of the latter. They were not created by collapse. They were revealed by it. Their presence does not negate the established account of the Great Fire, but it does introduce an additional layer that the standard narrative does not explore. The questions that arise from this addition are straightforward. What were these underground spaces originally built to serve? When were they constructed? And how did they come to exist beneath a district whose surface history is otherwise well documented? The historical record acknowledges their presence only briefly, before subsuming them into the broader category of clearance. The story continues above ground, while below, a different chapter is closed without being fully read. The underground spaces, exposed after the fire, did not present themselves as provisional solutions improvised for short-term use. Their physical characteristics pointed instead to construction intended to endure load, moisture, and time. Walls were described as thick and continuous, built of stone rather than brick or timber. Such thickness serves a purpose beyond enclosure. It resists lateral pressure from surrounding soil, dampens temperature fluctuation, and provides the compressive strength necessary to carry weight from above. These are not requirements imposed by shallow storage rooms. They are responses to the demands placed on structures meant to exist below ground for extended periods. The ceilings reinforce this impression. Instead of flat spans relying on beams, many of the underground rooms featured vaulted forms. An arch distributes load efficiently, transferring force outward and downward into supporting walls. This geometry reduces tensile stress and allows a space to support significant weight without collapse. Vaulting requires planning, skilled masonry, and precise alignment. It is chosen not for convenience, but for reliability. In underground construction, it signals an expectation that the space will remain in use and under load, not temporarily accessed and abandoned. Ventilation appears in the descriptions as well, though often indirectly. Passages and openings suggested pathways for air movement, connecting rooms or leading toward the surface. In enclosed underground environments, ventilation is not optional. It must be designed. The presence of corridors linking chambers implies circulation, both of air and of people. These features distinguish the spaces from isolated pits or simple cellars. They indicate an integrated layout, where movement and access were considered as part of the original design. When compared with typical 19th century storage basements in New York, the differences become clearer. Ordinary cellars were shallow, limited in extent, and built to support the floors above them rather than independent loads. Their walls were often thinner, their ceilings flat, their layouts confined to the footprint of a single building. They existed as ancillary spaces, subordinate to the structures above. The underground rooms revealed after the fire did not conform to this pattern. Their scale, construction, and connectivity suggested autonomy rather than dependency. Comparisons with European underground infrastructure provide further context. In older cities, extensive subsurface systems existed for storage, defense, and transport. These systems shared certain characteristics: durable materials, vaulted ceilings, and networks of corridors extending beneath multiple properties. Such infrastructure evolved over time, layered beneath the city as surface uses changed. The underground spaces uncovered in New York bore structural similarities to these systems, even if their historical trajectories differed. The resemblance lay not in ornament or purpose, but in engineering logic. None of this requires a reinterpretation of New York as a city with a hidden, fully developed subterranean past. It does, however, challenge the assumption that all underground construction in the early 19th century was modest and incidental. The physical evidence points to spaces designed with forethought, capable of sustaining use independent of the buildings above them. Their construction reflects an understanding of underground engineering that exceeds what would be necessary for temporary or auxiliary rooms. As clearance continued across multiple blocks, another pattern emerged. These underground spaces were not confined to a single site. They appeared in several locations affected by the fire, often in areas where multiple buildings had collapsed. Reports describe encounters with similar features across different properties, suggesting repetition rather than anomaly. The consistency of construction details reinforced this impression. Walls of comparable thickness, vaults of similar curvature, and corridors aligned along predictable directions indicated more than coincidence. Depth added to the sense of system. Some spaces lay well below the expected level of building foundations. Reaching them required removing layers of debris and soil beyond what would accumulate from a single collapse. This depth implies deliberate excavation at the time of construction, followed by long-term use rather than opportunistic digging. Connections between spaces hinted at planning across property boundaries, an approach inconsistent with individual cellar construction. When overlaid with reconstruction maps, the implications became more tangible. Streets realigned, lots were redefined, and new buildings rose without regard for what lay beneath. The underground spaces did not dictate surface planning. They were filled and forgotten as the city imposed a new order above them. Yet the fact that they spanned multiple future parcels suggests that their original layout predated the post-fire configuration of the district. This shift from isolated discovery to recurring pattern changes the scale of the question. A single, unusual cellar might be dismissed as idiosyncratic. Multiple interconnected spaces across a district indicate a broader framework. The underground was not simply a collection of private basements. It functioned as a layer of the city with its own logic, one that did not align neatly with the surface narrative that followed the fire. The reconstruction process prioritized continuity of commerce and urban growth. Anything that interfered with that objective was removed or neutralized. Filling underground spaces was faster and safer than integrating them into new plans. From an administrative perspective, treating them as debris simplified the task. From a material perspective, it erased a system rather than resolving it. What remains, in the historical record, is a series of brief acknowledgements rather than a full account. The underground spaces are noted as encountered and addressed, not as studied. Their repetition across sites hints at coordination in their original construction, yet that coordination is never examined. The city moves forward above ground, while below, a coherent layer is closed off and reclassified. This does not imply intentional omission. It reflects a moment when practical necessity outweighed curiosity. The fire demanded rebuilding, not excavation. The underground was an obstacle to be cleared, not a subject to be explored. Yet the physical characteristics of what was cleared suggest that it was more than a collection of ad hoc rooms. It was a system, encountered briefly, and then sealed beneath the next phase of the city, leaving behind a record that acknowledges its presence without fully accounting for its purpose or origin. As the city moved from shock to action, language became a tool of management. The documents produced in the months following the fire reveal a vocabulary focused on efficiency rather than interpretation. Underground spaces, regardless of their form or coherence, were grouped under administrative categories that simplified decision-making. Terms such as debris, rubble, and fill appear repeatedly in reports, contracts, and directives. Each term carried practical implications. Debris was something to be cleared. Rubble was material without structural value. Fill was matter to be used in leveling ground for new construction. None of these categories required further examination of origin or design. This shift in terminology mattered. A space described as a room invites questions about use and access. A space described as debris does not. Once underground chambers were classified within this framework, they ceased to be architectural features and became logistical problems. Their walls and vaults were no longer treated as structures, but as obstacles occupying valuable ground. The decision to fill them followed naturally from this classification. Filling reduced risk. It stabilized the surface. It allowed rebuilding to proceed without delay. The reasons recorded for this approach were concrete and immediate. Safety ranked high among them. Underground voids beneath burned districts posed hazards to workers and future occupants. Collapsed entrances, weakened walls, and unknown extents made assessment difficult. Filling eliminated uncertainty. Time was another factor. Commerce demanded restoration. Every day lost to investigation delayed recovery. Clearing and filling could be planned and executed quickly, while studying subsurface spaces would have required specialists, documentation, and coordination that the city was not prepared to prioritize in that moment. Cost also shaped the response. Excavation and preservation require resources. Mapping underground systems, reinforcing them, or integrating them into new construction would have increased expenses significantly. Insurance payouts, municipal budgets, and private capital were already strained by the scale of destruction. In this context, reclassifying underground spaces as rubble allowed their removal to be absorbed into existing cleanup operations rather than treated as separate projects. None of this required concealment or intent beyond practicality. Administrative language functioned as a filter, reducing complexity at a moment when complexity threatened progress. By defining what lay beneath the streets as fill, the city made it manageable. The ground could be leveled, new foundations could be laid, the surface narrative of recovery could continue uninterrupted. What this language did not capture was distinction. It did not differentiate between collapsed material and intact construction. It did not account for geometry, load-bearing design, or connectivity. Once underground spaces were labeled debris, their characteristics became irrelevant to the official process. The classification resolved the problem by dissolving it into a broader category. When attention turns to what the records do not include, this resolution becomes more apparent. There are no comprehensive drawings of the underground spaces uncovered after the fire. No full plans survive that trace corridors or map chambers across blocks. Reports mention encounters in passing, but do not compile them into an integrated picture. Without such documentation, the underground remains fragmented in the historical record, represented by isolated references rather than a coherent system. Equally absent are clear descriptions of function. The documents do not explain what these spaces were originally used for, nor do they speculate about their purpose. Storage, infrastructure, and other possibilities are not discussed in detail. The lack of functional attribution leaves the spaces undefined, known only by their physical presence and subsequent removal. Their past remains unarticulated. Dating presents a similar absence. The records do not establish when these underground structures were built. They are encountered in 1835, but that moment marks discovery rather than origin. No construction dates are attached. No earlier references are clearly linked to them. Without chronological anchors, the underground spaces float in time, acknowledged but not placed within a developmental sequence. What does remain consistent is the physical evidence noted during clearance. The structures exhibited load-bearing characteristics. Their walls were thick enough to support weight. Vaulted ceilings followed principles of compression. The geometry was rational, aligned, and repeated across sites. These features are not attributes of random collapse. They indicate construction undertaken with knowledge of underground engineering. Scale reinforces this impression. The underground spaces were not confined to single lots or buildings. They appeared across multiple properties, sharing characteristics that suggested coordination. Even as they were filled, their presence was encountered repeatedly, slowing work and requiring deliberate action to neutralize them. This recurrence points to a level of uniformity incompatible with ad hoc excavation. The contrast between what is physically evident and what is administratively recorded defines the character of the episode. The record does not deny the existence of underground structures. It simply does not elaborate on them beyond what was necessary to remove them. The absence of drawings, functions, and dates is not framed as loss. It is framed as irrelevance within the priorities of the moment. This gap is not the result of erasure. It is the product of selection. In a city focused on recovery and growth, questions that did not serve immediate goals were set aside. The underground, once reclassified as debris, no longer required explanation. Its role in the city's story was concluded through filling and leveling. What persists is a tension between material fact and documentary silence. The stones and vaults that once existed beneath the streets had form, strength, and order. The records that addressed them did so only long enough to justify their removal. Between these two realities lies an incomplete account, shaped not by suppression, but by administrative necessity. The city continued upward, carrying forward a narrative of resilience, while below, a structured layer was absorbed into the ground and into language that rendered it functionally invisible. Several academic hypotheses have been proposed to explain the underground structures encountered after the Great Fire, each grounded in known aspects of early urban development and each constrained by gaps in documentation. None of these hypotheses is conclusive. They coexist as plausible frameworks rather than competing answers, outlining a range of possibilities without closing the question. One interpretation situates the underground spaces within the context of early port and warehouse infrastructure. Lower Manhattan functioned as a commercial interface between land and sea, and storage was critical to that role. Subterranean rooms could have provided stable environments for goods sensitive to temperature or theft. Stone construction would have offered durability and fire resistance, qualities valued in dense mercantile districts. This hypothesis aligns with the city's economic character and explains why such spaces might be concentrated near the waterfront. Its limitation lies in scale and connectivity. Ordinary storage cellars typically correspond to individual properties and do not extend across multiple lots or form continuous systems. The vaulted rooms and corridors described after the fire suggest coordination beyond what private warehouse owners would usually undertake independently. A second hypothesis considers the underground as part of pre-urban technical works. Before the city assumed its later form, the area underwent phases of drainage, shoreline modification, and infrastructure development. Subsurface construction may have supported these efforts, housing conduits, retaining structures, or service corridors intended to manage water and terrain. This interpretation accounts for robust construction and for spaces that do not align neatly with later property boundaries. Its strength is functional logic. Engineering works often precede visible urbanization and may later be obscured or repurposed. Its weakness is evidentiary. Documentation of such projects is limited, and the surviving descriptions do not explicitly link the underground spaces to known technical initiatives. A third approach emphasizes reuse across multiple periods. Cities evolve by layering new functions onto old structures. Underground spaces can persist through these transitions, adapting to changing needs. A chamber built for one purpose may later serve another, accumulating modifications over time. In this view, the spaces revealed in 1835 were not the product of a single project, but the result of incremental development. This hypothesis explains variation in form and the difficulty of assigning a single date or function. Its challenge lies in verification. Without detailed plans or stratigraphic records, distinguishing phases of reuse remains speculative. Each hypothesis accounts for certain aspects of the evidence while leaving others unresolved. Warehouse infrastructure explains economic rationale but not system-wide integration. Pre-urban engineering explains durability but lacks direct documentary support. Multi-phase reuse explains complexity but resists precise reconstruction. None of these frameworks requires extraordinary assumptions. All remain consistent with known urban processes. Yet none alone fully explains the coherence, extent, and subsequent disappearance of the underground layer. The persistence of uncertainty raises a broader question about historical attention. Why do these underground findings occupy such a marginal place in the story of the city? The answer lies less in the structures themselves than in how urban history is typically told. The history of New York is often organized around growth and commerce. Narratives emphasize expansion, trade, innovation, and upward movement. The city is portrayed as a surface phenomenon, rising from shoreline to skyline through successive waves of development. This approach privileges visible change and economic momentum. It highlights what is built, sold, and moved above ground. Within this framework, subsurface layers are secondary. They are treated as technical details rather than as historical actors. Foundations support buildings but rarely enter the story. Infrastructure is discussed when it enables growth, not when it complicates it. Underground spaces that do not clearly contribute to a narrative of progress are easy to overlook. There is also a methodological preference at work. Written records favor what was planned, named, and administered. Underground structures, especially those encountered incidentally, often lack these attributes. They appear in documents as problems to be addressed, not as subjects to be chronicled. Once filled and built over, they leave little trace accessible to historians who rely on textual sources. The language of progress reinforces this tendency. Rebuilding after the fire is framed as a forward leap, an opportunity to modernize and improve. Dwelling on buried structures risks slowing that narrative. It introduces ambiguity where clarity is preferred. As a result, the underground becomes a footnote, acknowledged briefly, and then subsumed beneath the story of renewal. Archaeological perspectives offer tools to address such layers, but in a dense, continuously occupied city, excavation is limited. Opportunities to study subsurface features arise sporadically, often under pressure to complete construction. Without sustained investigation, findings remain isolated. They are recorded, classified, and then covered again. The result is a selective memory shaped by practicality and narrative emphasis. The city remembers what aligns with its self-image as a place of constant advancement. What lies beneath, especially when it does not fit neatly into that image, remains under-examined. The underground structures revealed in 1835 fall into this category. They are neither denied nor fully integrated. They exist at the edge of awareness. This does not imply that the prevailing history is flawed. It reflects the choices inherent in storytelling. Every narrative prioritizes certain elements and leaves others in the background. In New York's case, the emphasis on growth and commerce has produced a powerful, coherent story. It has also left limited space for layers that complicate the linear ascent from past to present. The underground spaces, once exposed and then reclassified, illustrate how material evidence can persist without reshaping narrative. They remind us that cities are not only built upward and outward, but also over and around what came before. The question of what lay beneath New York after the Great Fire remains open, not because it challenges the city's history, but because it sits outside the angles from which that history is most often viewed. The city was rebuilt with urgency and confidence. Streets were realigned, widened, and paved anew. Brick and stone replaced timber where possible, and commerce returned to the waterfront with renewed intensity. Above ground, the Great Fire of 1835 became a marker of transformation, a moment after which New York accelerated into its modern identity. The skyline changed, the rhythm of the streets shifted. What had burned was replaced, and what replaced it carried the promise of permanence. Beneath those new streets, older layers remained. Foundations from earlier buildings were cut through or incorporated without ceremony. Underground spaces revealed during cleanup were filled, leveled, and sealed. Their walls and vaults became part of the ground itself, absorbed into the base upon which the next phase of the city rose. Once the surface was restored, there was little reason to look down again. The city's attention moved upward and outward. This process was not unique to New York. Cities grow by overlaying one era onto another, often without preserving clear boundaries between them. Each generation builds according to its needs, reusing, burying, or erasing what no longer serves immediate purposes. Over time, these decisions accumulate, producing landscapes where continuity is visible on the surface but layered beneath. Walking through New York today, the ground feels solid and resolved. Sidewalks stretch across blocks without interruption. Buildings align with confidence, their foundations assumed rather than questioned. The city presents itself as a finished product, even as it continues to change. There is little to suggest that below the pavement lie spaces once large enough to be entered, once structured enough to support vaults and corridors. Those underground spaces are no longer accessible. They have been reclassified not only in records but in physical reality. Filled with rubble and soil, they ceased to function as spaces and became material. In doing so, they exited the city's active memory. What remains is not absence, but quiet incorporation. The city did not remove its underground layer, it built over it. This layered condition complicates how urban history is understood. Official narratives tend to move forward in time, tracing development through visible change. They emphasize construction rather than accumulation, beginnings rather than continuities. Subsurface layers disrupt this clarity. They introduce ambiguity about origin, purpose, and sequence. They suggest that the city's past is not entirely linear, but stratified. There is no need to resolve these ambiguities to acknowledge them. The underground spaces uncovered after the fire do not require a single explanation. They do not demand reinterpretation of the city's entire history. They simply indicate that the ground beneath New York holds more than foundations for what we see today. It holds remnants of decisions, structures, and systems that were once functional and are now inert. As the city continues to grow, these layers remain in place, largely untouched. New infrastructure is threaded around them or through them. Occasionally, construction exposes fragments again, only for them to be documented briefly and reburied. The pattern repeats, not because the past is hidden, but because the present has little time for it. The Great Fire of 1835 is remembered for what it destroyed and what it enabled. Less remembered are the moments when the fire stripped away the surface and revealed a different city beneath. That city did not return to view, but it did not disappear either. It became part of the ground. The streets carry traffic, buildings rise and fall, life continues at the surface. Beneath it all, layers persist, unnamed and largely unexamined. And the question lingers, not as an accusation or a conclusion, but as a quiet reflection shaped by the city itself. How many layers of history are we walking on every day, and how many of them have never been called by the names they once had?